Thank you all for coming, and thank you, JLF, for this signal honor of inviting photography among a league of brilliant writers. I feel like a bit of an interloper, but I hope there will be points of sort of cohesion and coherence between the different art forms. Thank you for accepting this invitation, Stephen. Stephen had a wonderful show of Indian photography here in Houston, and I was very proud and privileged to be a part of, as a writer of that catalog. Now, the two books, Points of View is 15 essays by brilliant photography scholars. You know, photography was considered pretty much an arriviste, the last recognized sort of art form, so to speak. It's only in about the 1980s that the star photographer becomes a persona in the art firmament. But it's important for us to understand that when we talk about modernity, when we talk about initiative and sheer inventive brilliance, I think Indian photography beats painting, sculpture, and many of the traditional art forms hands down, also in terms of periodization. So what we're going to do today is also look at a little bit at the first book, but mainly at the second book, The Archival Gaze, which my colleagues at Critical Collective and I put together over a period of 7 years. What we've tried to do through COVID and everything that entailed was to piece together studios, initiatives, photographers, inventions, aesthetics, techniques from the 1840s to 2020. I mean, we end literally with the photographs that Anita Khemka, a brilliant photographer, takes of COVID. How do you visualize COVID within the family? This is then something that I hope you will all enjoy, and we'll just get into the talk. We have 3 subsections. The first one is looking at photography, pretty much the British Indian period. You can look at it within the range of the colonial lens. The second is to look at the aspect of enactment. There seems to be in Indian photography a genius for performativity. You know, the great photography critic and writer and philosopher Roland Barthes used the Sanskrit term tat-hat. He said it was tat-hat. We would say tatvam, asi, which would be this is what it is. And Barthes says the photograph is what it is. But we see very early the Indian photographer says, no, let me challenge the representational aspect of photography and produce something that isn't of this moment, something that is purely of the imaginative, something that is disruptive of reality. And the third is a subject I got deeply interested in, and that is the crowd. How do we see India, particularly in the mass media, on Twitter, historically, through great crises? It is the crowd. And there's no other art form which seems to be able to capture, you know, the millions, so to speak, of the subcontinent coming together, raising their voice in protest or in endorsement or in support. So these are the 3 brief subsections, and I'm going to take a deep dive right away. Oops. Yeah, so the first is the figure, and I'm trying to show you here the picture by Samuel Bourne. Samuel Bourne has been described as the most aesthetically aware sort of photographer of the 19th century by Chris Pinney. What Bourne does is that he goes to the Himalayas with 60, 70 coolies with his wet collodion sort of glass plate negatives, and he uses the human figure like this, as he does in this architectural work, which is as a tiny little figure. So the figure is of itself of no consequence except to demonstrate the magnificence of the environment. When photography comes to India, there is a great amount of social change, and this particular picture by Tytler and Shepard of the dying Bahadur Shah Zafar is symptomatic of that time. The Mughal Empire has disintegrated. Zafar is being sent to Rangoon on exile, but other things are also happening. All the painters in the court are scattering. They're going to other hill states. Some of them also take up photography and become studio artists. Chemical printing and printmaking become, you know, everyday affairs, which was earlier only consigned to the world of painting. 4 British art schools between 1850 and 1870 come up within the Indian subcontinent. One of them is now, of course, the National College of Art in Lahore, in Pakistan. And this is a moment where change seems to be, there's a kind of a hybridity of views, of politics, and of the methods and the materials that are being used. The British start 2 or 3 things. Of course, they want to understand the subcontinent. So there is this terrific enterprise of mapping the subcontinent. They set up the various archaeological survey, the geological survey, etc., to literally sort of embrace the subcontinent through acts of surveillance, noting, plotting, and so on. They also want to understand the people of the country. But very often the photograph is like this. So there's this entire volume, which you may be aware of, People of India, which is 1868 to 1875, put together, which puts together the tribes, the smaller communities, the typicalities, so to speak. But the figures may be fairly quiet, passive, abject, and seen outside their own natural context. I should tell you that in this volume of photographs, there are 465 or 468 pictures. These travel all over Europe, and this picture of relative abjection, so to speak, of the people of the subcontinent makes its way across the world. This is the typical Indian photographer of the royal court. The Maharajas have the money, particularly those in Rajasthan. They have the money, they have the imagination, and they have great curiosity. Mohanlal, who works in the court of the Maharaja of Udaipur, takes a number of pictures for him. And then this Nawab Ahmad Ali Khan. Nawab Ahmad Ali Khan was one of the brilliant figures of the 1850s. He records the family of Wajid Ali Shah before Wajid Ali Shah is sort of exiled. He's sent away to Matya Burj, I think 1856 or 1857. Again, a part of this great sort of social upheaval. But as you can see, the decorative elements of the making of the photograph are quite profound. And Nawab Ahmad Ali Khan is an interesting character. He makes these pictures, he supports the uprising of 1857, he's dropped like a hot potato by all his British patrons, and it's only in the 1860s that some photographic societies sort of bring him back into the world of photography. But then there is also this. This is Daroga Abbas Ali. Daroga Abbas Ali turns out to be more than a Daroga. He turns out to be a magnificent photographer. And he produces 2 books. One is about the Talukdars, the Zamindars, the sort of landed aristocrats of the north of, what would be called the United Provinces, UP. But he also takes pictures of what was called the courtesan. There's been an enormous amount of research in recent, decades about what was the figure of the courtesan. Was she the belittled view of the British, so to speak? But then you have writers like Veena Oldenburg who say that she was actually the custodian of the cultures of the North, the refinement of the court of Awadh. And these pictures are particularly interesting. We just heard this previous session about nostalgia. Now, if we look at this work, this is 1874. Wajid Ali Shah has been exiled in the 1850s. But where is this culture of the courtesan surviving for the next 20 years? Possibly in the realm of nostalgia, memorialization. And in a sense, what Daroga Abbas Ali is also doing is creating a commercial venture out of this. He's dressed them up so beautifully, or he's got them to pose in a studio setting, but then these are being sold as postcards. This is really the moment of Orientalism for all the students of Said and of painting, of say Ang or Alma Tadema at this time, and those are hothouse pictures, very overheated pictures of the Orient. Daroga Abbas Ali, in a certain sense, restores the dignity of the courtesan in these kinds of pictures. I also wanted to show you 2 or 3 pictures. This is the professional photographer. Narayan Daji actually is a doctor in Bombay who has a very flourishing practice with his brother Bhau Daji, who sets up that great museum, or after whom that museum is named. And these are the Vallabhacharya Maharajas that he's taken a picture of. And you can see that they have, the sitar. This is, of course, the rosary, the books of their trade, which are religious books, and carrying these. So as compared to the British enterprise of the people of India and abject figures posing. These are much more participatory and alive pictures. I love this because I thought we could have a discussion about this at some point. This is really the chosen family, the Hijras being eunuchs, but they forming a community of their own and disbanding with normal family portraiture in the 19th century. And it's being done by an Indian photographer, Chunilal. So already there is this sense of, I think, venturing out to a certain extent. And we were lucky we got this picture from Bonham's and we could reproduce this in our book. This is a man whom I consider an absolute photographic genius, Maharaja Ram Singh. His parents die when he's 2. He's brought up by his aunt and the British resident. He's a technological maverick in a certain sense. He brings great improvement to the state of Jaipur, tarred roads, electrical lighting, the Mayo Hospital, the museum that is named after Alfred in the British pecking order, the royal pecking order. And what he does is that by 1864, we know he has imported 20 cameras. Somewhere nobody knows about this except that when Gayatri Devi in an India Today story tells us that Gayatri Devi was having a clean out of the Jaipur palace, and what popped up suddenly in the mid-1980s was 2,700 glass plate negatives. Look at this. Look at this carefully, because this is how he was using the agency of the photograph. And why did he need to have a studio within the Dui Chhatti, the double-storied roof of the city palace? It was because he was creating a personal archive of the kind that is possibly non-existent anywhere, certainly in South Asia. 2,700 glass plate negatives, 20 cameras, a camera for the Kati visit, a library of books on photography. And the subject was himself. He took masterly pictures of himself, and there was a particular reason. He understood the power of reproducibility. You know, it is not that he didn't have painters coming to his court. There's Val Prinsep, who comes and writes about his zenana. Let's not use the orientalizing word harem. Let's stick with zenana. This is very important. These are the marks of the Shaivite. Now, Ram Singh breaks violently with tradition. He expels all the Vishnu worshippers in his court to the neighboring state of Bikaner. He converts himself into a Shaivite. And then, with this kind of, self-portrait in a vignette, which he has printed in postcards. Postcards have just come to India, but he's a technological, he understands the power of the machine age. And he sends these all over Rajasthan to announce that he has now converted his faith. And these are the women of his harem. The 2,700 glass plate negatives have at least 1,500 images of women of the zenana. And you can see that they are quite enterprising. Here's one as a cross-dresser. This is supposed to be his most favorite woman in the harem, called Ram Sukhi. We know because Val Prinsep also paints her and writes about her. And what is interesting is, please note, this is not like Almata Dema or Ang, where these are beauties for, only pleasure. These are women who are being given the space of the studio as a social equalizer. The British resident, the other Rajput royals are all shot in the same equalizing space. Now we jump about 30 years to the next really important photographer. Ram Singh dies very prematurely in 1880. He's only 43 years old. In 1870, he writes a diary, and we know that he photographed every single day. This photographer, Umrao Singh Shergill, who turns out, as we know later, to be the grandfather of Vivan Sundaram, is also a deeply private photographer. His daughter Amrita Shergill, the famous artist, was showing her work in Simla, in Delhi. She sought out Nehru. She was quite the arrived figure on the Indian art scene. I think Umrao Singh in many ways is a more important artist. He was already understanding what the camera could do. For him, the camera is entirely interior. Look at this picture. Here is Amrita Shergill in the, oops, sorry, I'll just go back. Amrita Shergill wearing sandals in their flat in the Rue du Bussano in Paris. Look at the level of interiority. The Shergill family, Umrao Singh runs away because he does something against the British. So he and his Hungarian wife and their 2 daughters spend several years in Europe. We don't have a single picture of Europe. Or at least Europe of the street, Europe of the wars. This is all between the First and the Second World War. There is food shortages, there are cities under siege, nothing. The entire archive is about the women in the family and again, of course, himself. Hey, Amrita Shergill. And himself, 1904. This there are many pictures which would suggest the same level of narcissism as Ram Singh, as you saw. And here, him posing as a yogic look at the kharawas, please, the Indian shoes that even Gandhi was to wear, and which Umrao Singh, as you know, a man married to a European, traveling all over Europe, would not necessarily be using every day. So there is a certain amount of image of himself as the self-conscious poseur. And I put these 2 men together for you to see what were they doing. Can we, through these photographs, look at an anticipatory kind of South Asian masculinity? This is not of the suit, this is not of the Rajput royal court. You know, Jaipur was the richest court in North India. And the fact that Ram Singh chooses to portray himself as a Shaivite devotee, but with none of the trappings of the court. He's photographed his Darbar hall, it's grand with chandeliers and so on. But when he presents himself as an ascetic worshipper, it's with these bare implements of his everyday worship. And here we see Umrao Singh doing something very similar, again in the same flat, 26 years after that first picture. He's been fasting for 14 days, and there is this ascetic body, you know, sort of looking, so to speak, out into the future across Paris, sort of across the rooftops of Paris, but very much within the orientalizing frame of this particular picture. And in a way, can we think of them then anticipating the body of Gandhi, the body of passivity, but also resistance and a certain non-violence. And when we see this against the corpus of the European body and how that inhabited South Asia, we can understand that there is a certain kind of a visual principle, a certain kind of philosophic principle at work. This is Walter Bozard. This is a photographer I had the privilege of curating for the first time in India. Walter Bozard crosses from Europe across Afghanistan into India, follows Gandhi from Sabarmati to Dandi, and that's where, before Gandhiji is going to take the march, he's there. I'll show you some more pictures. It's really a fantastic thing. Bozard also, for photography buffs, then goes to China, and he lives there for several years and shoots Mao. So the exhibition that we had in Delhi was Gandhi and Mao, you know, together. It was an interesting thing to do. And this is Kanu Gandhi. Kanu Gandhi is the nephew of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi had what he called a darshan dilemma. I don't want anybody taking my darshan. The darshan in Hindi is the gaze. But this is a complementary gaze. I gaze at you, you gaze back. And darshan is not between me and Stephen or me and the audience. It's usually me and the deity. The deity gazes back and blesses me, and I gaze at the deity. And in a way, Gandhi then sets himself up as this figure sort of deserving of the darshan or the recipient of darshan, and he says, I hate photography. He gives Kanu Gandhi very strict rules. I will not let you photograph me casually. I will not let you force me to pose. You must stand at a certain distance. I will not pay for it. So this goes on for some years, and then G.D. Birla, in his generosity, gives Kanu Gandhi a camera and 100 rupees to buy his photographic reels. And then Kanu Gandhi produces in a spate 2,000 pictures of the Mahatma. So I think we've come more or less to the end of our first session. Stephen, questions?
Well, I'm wondering about the transition from colonialist photography on the subcontinent, and then how it's taken up by practitioners on the subcontinent, and what the lack of a pedagogical structure meant to this development of gazing at oneself or the figures. And as a secondary question, I wonder if you could talk about the privacy aspect of, two of the most important figures, Ram Singh and Rao Singh.
I think that the turning of the gaze on oneself was what they saw as the potential of the camera. And it's not something that would have been easy to share. I don't think Ram Singh talked about it at great length to anybody. We know that Louis Rousselet, who was a very important French artist and photographer, traveled through Jaipur, lived in the court, talked a little bit, but he didn't talk about necessarily about what he was trying to do with the camera. Even that 6-month diary that he maintains from August to about January 1870, he doesn't talk about what is the camera doing for me, myself. It's a similar thing with Rao Singh. It's sort of the sense of what the camera was doing for them was not something that was a matter of public discussion. And certainly Amrita Shergill in all her letters also doesn't reflect upon it. So there is a sense of a covert kind of a practice, while there was also a public practice. Ram Singh was taking his the nobles at court, he was and perhaps sharing those pictures.
Right.
We have a bunch of those. You're talking about the absence of pedagogy and self-reflexivity, and was there, and I imagine there was a correlated question about what was the relationship being drawn between painting and self-portraiture in painting, and photography. I think that there is pedagogy comes in fairly easily because the British now want to map India, and there are instructions that are being given out that you must cover as much of India as possible. The Governor Generals, the Lord and Lady Canning, were patrons of photography. They patronized salons like the Simla Salon. Colin Mackenzie's wife was a writer. She travels across the subcontinent. She creates 3 books on India, and she leaves sketches and photographs of what the subcontinent was like. So one person who responds to the pedagogic was Deen Dayal. We'll just see a picture of Deen Dayal. He's trained at the Thompson College at Roorkee, which is now IIT Roorkee. And he would have been trained as a draftsman, but he uses the photograph very, very successfully.
And were these photographers aware, they must have been also aware of sort of the ethnographic gaze that was happening at the same time.
That's right.
Right. And in fact, I think that covert sense of their photography was in some ways an act of resistance against
this? Think so. Yes, I think so. And I wanted to point out that this picture of the Vaishnav gurus that we saw, the Vallabhacharyas, they were seated somewhere in Bombay. This became there was a huge scandal attached to the Vallabhacharyas. There was a court case against the leading figure of certain Vaishnav temples, and because they were felt to be, they were accused of debauchery. It was a very famous case, and it was considered more famous than even the case of Warren Hastings in the subcontinent. And it was suggested that Ram Singh was aware of this information and the photographs of the Vallabhacharyas, and that's where he expels an entire sect from the kingdom of Rajasthan. Now that's an extraordinary thing to do. He expels the figures who represent the faith of his fathers, and he denies them the power and the agency of the photograph in the politics of the subcontinent is seen in these sort of ways. It can be read that I deny you presence, I deny you lands, I deny you patronage, I expel you. Because of this kind of, the mass media had picked up on the Vallabhacharyas and their acts of debauchery in their temples.
And in what sense is Rao Singh perhaps the beginning of this next phase that you want to talk about, the enactment?
I think he's really a figure on the cusp. He takes forward what Ram Singh has said or done. He has no knowledge perhaps of Ram Singh's photographs, but when I look at him, is he thinking of Nijinsky? Is he thinking of the Ballet Russe in Paris? When we look at the pictures and see what he's doing with the daughters are forever posing. The daughters, Amrita and Indira, are always dressed in extraordinary clothes, which is nothing like what 2 little girls should be. Sometimes as Native Americans, sometimes as figures from a Hollywood film. And you wonder if that's not one source of inspiration. So maybe we should take it forward to the chapter on enactment. This is really interesting. So the temple town of Nathdwara has what we call, of course, the pictures of Srinathji. Srinathji is the black dark icon which has been brought from Andhra Pradesh by Vallabhacharya, installed in Nathdwara, and the devotees now are able to collaborate with the photo studios to produce acts of perpetual devotion. These works were called Manorath paintings. Ideally, what the devotee would do is to come to Nathdwara again for darshan, all right? And in the process, visit the studio of Ghasiram Hardev Sharma, 1900. So photography is already about 60 years old. They've understood its potential to subvert, disrupt the actual moment. Ghasiram Hardev Sharma would take the entire frame, cut out the faces and the hands, and then the rest of the body would be painted on. Now, I think this is, up for anybody who's been even seeing films in Hindustan forever, in India, will notice that the dedication of the film is often to the dear departed. And they are garlanded, and very often they were overpainted, particularly when photographs were black and white. Indians resisted the monochrome, and they would introduce color to make it more lively, more lifelike. And I think this was a period where they felt that they can replace or approximate the value of the miniature painting. Indian elites like Maharajas, etc., would be able to present each other albums of miniature painting for my son's head shaving ceremony, for his wedding, etc. Now I had a colored photograph doing this for me for much less money, and I could reproduce it and send it to all my family. This is very interesting. This is technology in different, so Nathdwara, it becomes a sort of act of devotion. Here in the hands of Shapur Bhedwar. Shapur Bhedwar is probably India's most famous pictorialist, and I hope we get a chance to talk about the rise of the art photographer, so to speak. Bhedwar is a Parsi. He learns photography in England. He becomes a member of the Brotherhood of the Linked Ring, and they are all pictorialists. But what Bhedwar does is to imagine a Zoroastrian past. What were the Zoroastrian narratives like? And in his studio, in his home in Bombay, he sets about this kind of an enactment. And he becomes hugely successful. Each of these are parts of series of photographs. They traveled to international competitions. Edward Steichen, actually, who then becomes really affiliated with MoMA and runs magazines and is the most powerful sort of photographic presence in the United States, praises Bhedwar to the skies. And these pictures are actually entered in the World Columbian exhibition of 1893. This is his acolyte and the person who follows him, Jahangir Tarapurewala, again imagining a Zoroastrian grand past. And the way the studio was used, this is typical studio photography. There'll be columns, there'll be curtains, there'll be props, and many Indians would use it to suggest that my status is of the educated or the aristocratic in the studio setting. We jump nearly 100 years, but this is very much in the line of what the contemporary photographer wants to do. And some of these things are to question colonial photography. Samuel Bourne, who we talked about, visits India only for 7 years, 1863 to 1870. But he makes time to go to the Nilgiris and shoot the Todas. The Todas were a tribe which were considered, very pastoral, almost biblical in their innocence, etc. And what they did, of course, in their ethnographic gaze was measure them, with scalpels and all sorts of measuring the height, the dimensions of the forehead, etc., as if they were a different racial species. And there were great extensive notations. So, of course, Pushpamala does this. She behaves as if she's a Toda, and she dresses up as if, and she collaborates with Claire Arney, but she makes it into a very camp kind of a picture, dark glasses. And if there is a modern Toda, this is what the Toda would look like. Similarly, Ravi Varma, she mimics. She's a performative artist in that sense, so she's always at the center of her own pictures. Here, of course, she's, She's mimicking Ravi Varma's Lakshmi, and she makes it, spurious enough for you to recognize that this is just a kind of a play act. This is a long question. What is
yes,
she planning
it is.
to do with
but
it?
it's also they're both including these nostalgic elements too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But also it's about the depiction of women. She's particularly interested in what was the gendered narrative, and these are, I think, part of Native women of South India, and there are about 250 pictures in this series where she tries to analyze what were the Native women of South India being represented as.
And self-represented. Very important that they're the photographers themselves.
Right. These are, again, the photographer Indu Antony. She takes, this is Indu Antony, she comes after Pushpamala, but she takes the tropes of South Indian male heroes and she gender cross-dresses to look like Shotgun Murugan and other kinds of figures. I mean, they're pretty hilarious, but they instill the question. They not only make you look at aspects of her in that role, but what was the nature of masculinity that is being projected. And this is Vidisha Fedecha. She speaks for trans figures, and she's representing the work here. Again, this is a trope from the cinematic. And the famous Sunil Gupta, you've had collaborations.
Oh, yes.
And this was, of course, a work that was pulled down in India on the opening day. It's a series of pictures. When I was curating a show in Vancouver, at the Vancouver Art Gallery, we showed all of them, which is really about the imagination of a young Indian entering into a relationship with a white man, and the Turkish bath sort of environment, or the gay bath, which is a scene of encounter, and
the Orientalism.
And the Orientalism
of the Western
white
man
gaze
onto the Asian male.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
But the desired body in this case sort of collapses or dies at the end, right?
Yes.
And that's something I didn't quite get, but we can perhaps understand.
Well, it's great tragedy in his work.
Why would a gay encounter end so badly is the question.
Well, this was made also, after the post-AIDS, really, and HIV/AIDS, and that's been a very important driving force in Gupta's work since his diagnosis in the 90s.
Yes. With AIDS, that's right. So we have 5 minutes? Oops, we've got a whole section left. Should we go racing?
Yes, let's go at light speed.
We're going to go racing through.
Some beautiful
so this
pictures.
Was also enactment, Anita Khimka, wonderful artist. How do families see themselves during COVID? So they literally take the back wall of their community and they put up pictures. She asks people in the same housing block to bring their pictures and perhaps, envisage how would they like to be seen in this very critical time. As you know, Delhi had a horrendous encounter with COVID. What does the crowd mean? The crowd is a particular subject because the picture of the crowd belongs to nobody. Nobody claims the crowd picture. But the crowd is actually, can we see it as a social barometer? Can we see it as an index of the sociology and the politics of the time? And how do we read a nation's history if we look at the pictures of the crowd? So for me as a curator and a writer, this was something that was fascinating, and it just seemed to emerge from this second book, this one on the left. So this is Deen Dayal. You had a question about the trained photographer. This is Deen Dayal, who becomes a favorite with the Maharajas and Indian upper classes. He's a great entrepreneur. He has 3 or 4 major studios running. He even has a Zenana studio only for women. And this is where he shoots the great Delhi Darbar of 1903. So the coming of the Rajput chiefs on their elephants, it must have been a grand moment. But the crowd is also signaling something else. This is other than, even temples were sites of separation, but there were no real public spheres in India. You have the Esplanade in Calcutta, you have Shivaji Maidan in Bombay, you have Jantar Mantar in Delhi. Now you don't even have, Rajpath in Delhi anymore. We did not have those kinds of town squares which were designated for protest or for gathering, etc. So how was the public sphere being determined? This is Gandhi, again by Walter Bozard. And he is actually, even though he has a darshan dilemma, he's really the initiator of the great crowd. And the crowd, by this I mean the eroding of lines of community, caste, difference, male, female, etc. So he starts out with 75 people from Sabarmati, and he lands up in Dandi, and there are streams and streams of thousands of them congregating. And
amazing.
here I want to show you, this is an amazing picture. It's really not a very good picture, but it's so amazing because it actually obliterates the icon. Here Gandhi is the icon, whom everybody, the crowd is rushing towards. But here the crowd itself becomes iconic because of its sheer mass and its energy. And he's addressing people in Bengal after communal riots. And there is a moment of epiphany. They've all got their hands up and they're probably singing with him or something like that. But you can't see Gandhi. Of course, partition. And there are many important photographers who start to congregate at this time, and you'll see some of their names. But this is from a Government of India archive. The trains coming with the refugees from Pakistan. And Gandhi's ashes, just a year later. Another train journey. This is probably, this is probably here. We have Jawaharlal. And they're encouraging people to step back because they're all weeping and sort of pushing themselves at this train which is carrying Gandhi's ashes. And I think India seems to have a sort of a special place for acts of public mourning. We see this again and again where there are assassinations and deaths. Here, Homai Vyarawala, the only woman photographer among a posse of men, and I think she really deserves notice. But this is the state sort of carriage of Gandhi's ashes for Allahabad. The crowded street. So you have Raghu Rai, you have Ram Rahman, you have Raghubir Singh, Mahendra Singh. So many people. This is a picture by Salim Paul, where there is a convergence of streets, the crowded Indian metropolis, the pushing and the shoving. You know, we have a number of words. There is the Khalbali, Afratafri. These are Arabic words, and they go back to the time of the invasions of Delhi of the 1750s under Nadir Shah. But then you have Chakka Jam, you have Dhakkam Dhakka, Mukka Mukki. All these are terms which suggest the great crowds. And how, in a way, the crowd is also a barometer of a certain loss of innocence. It's a certain of the social fabric. The Gandhian crowds are surging towards him in adoration of the Mahatma. That is India at its pure and India at its best in a certain sense. And these are the crowds of the anti-Sikh riots at the time of Indira Gandhi's assassination. Connaught Place is burning. Safdar Hashmi, Ram Rahman. This is, again, seeds of protest. He's a civil activist. He's doing a play and he's killed. So just the sheer spontaneous nature of coming together.
They're important documents of historical moments, but also a social barometer.
Absolutely. Feminism's record, because it comes onto the streets. The streets of India sort of mark social change. And feminism in the 80s is a huge protest against dowry or violence, domestic violence. And Shiba Chachi sort of, this is Satyarani Chadda. And her daughter, who she was so proud of educating, has probably had a terrible end in a dowry death. And Shiba, as an activist, records all these, but then creates an entire body of work. So this business of transitioning from the street into the gallery and the museum, and then how does the work of what is seen or can be categorized as photojournalism become the museum object? That's through photographers like Pablo, like Raghu Rai, like Shiba.
Ram Rahman.
Phulan Devi, this is also interesting about, there is a certain amorality in a crowd. I mean, here she is, she's a daku, she's been a dacoit, she's surrendering, she's standing on top of a bus. Sandeep Shankar takes her picture. But don't forget, she also stands for elections. And, she can then see herself as a possible member of the Lok Sabha of India. So this think about the crowds will gather. Are these acts of endorsement? Are they curiosity? What are they? And I think we have our final couple of pictures, so we're not doing badly. This was irresistible. The only you don't have your master photographers shooting these pictures because of COVID sort of restrictions. But the surge of people that came out from the cities and wanted to go back to wherever they had come from. And these were the kinds of scenes. You know, I want to mention over here about the receding of the camera. The portrait invites,
Very
the
visible.
intimate portrait. And then Susan Sontag talks about the recessionary role of the photographer. Not necessarily. The camera comes very close, but in the crowds, the camera seems to have no particular stance of its own. It's just recording. It's recording and it's giving you the moment as it is. Tattvamasi, as Roland Barthes would say. And this is a moment of the churn in the Republic.
And the technology, I think, plays a big role in that too, and has democratized the ability of the photographers to take it up. You know.
That's right.
I know that we're running out of time.
How are we doing, Neha? Time up? Okay. Sorry, so we can't take any questions, but yeah. But thank you all. This was fun, and I enjoyed making this presentation.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Stephen.